Welcome back to the Arsenal Pass YouTube channel. It is Hayden here and back with something that I love to talk about. It's another limited video, and this time we're talking about Monarch Draft. We have, of course, the Dusk Till Dawn War of the Monarch events coming up this weekend. We have Nationals on the horizon, which is Monarch Draft, or partly Monarch Draft for a lot of Nationals around the world. Plus, of course, Skirmish Season 7, which features some amount of draft events for Monarch around the globe. So I'm super excited to be back drafting Monarch. It has been a long time since I've drafted Monarch. I've gotten back to it in the last few weeks in preparation for some of these events, but it is a set that I think is very unique. It's very cool. It's very different to some of the sets that we've drafted recently, like Uprising and Outsiders, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But yeah, I want to share in this video some tips and tricks, sort of an overview of the Monarch Draft format, talk about the heroes and how to draft them, some of the key cards you should look out for, and just a bit of a crash course on drafting Monarch if maybe you're heading to a War of the Monarch event this weekend, or you're looking just to get started in it, practicing for Nationals, things like that. So before I kick into it, do want to say if you enjoy the videos that we put out here at Arsenal Pass, please do go and throw us a like on the video, maybe even drop a comment, tell us, what you've learned from this video or what you want to see more expanded on from this Monarch crash course and draft, this 101 video. Or perhaps, maybe you've got some questions or some differences of opinion on cards that you like in the heroes in Monarch. Also, drop us a sub on the channel as well. It all helps as we head towards 6,000 subs at this point in time. So, I want to get into it first of all and talk a little bit about Monarch Draft. If maybe you're brand new to drafting, I would suggest maybe not starting with this Monarch video. We did do a Welcome to Wraith 101 video about a year ago before the Farewell to Welcome to Wraith events. You can go and check those out for a bit more of a crash course and sort of basics of drafting, or you can listen to our draft pods that we've done previously on the Arsenal Pass podcast, which you can find here on YouTube or Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. But yeah, with that said, some of the things about Monarch that I think are really interesting, because it is a really cool format and it is quite unique. There's some real differences if you've drafted Uprising or Outsiders previously. One of those being the 4 versus the 3 heroes, or the 6 heroes but 3 classes that we had in Outsiders, and then 3 heroes and classes in Uprising. Now you have 4 in Monarch, and that's what we kind of had for a long time when Flesh and Blood first started. We had 4 in Welcome to Wraith, we had 4 in Arcane Rising, we had 4 in Monarch, before we went to this kind of 3 hero class structure with Tales of Aria. And we haven't gone back since, but we are heading back with Monarch. And it adds a bit of a different dynamic. Now, when you have this kind of 3 class or hero split like we've had for the last few sets, you usually end up with this kind of 3-3-2 kind of dynamic in your draft pod. And often, you want to be one of the 2 drafters. It's kind of a one you position yourself to. Or there might be a class that is slightly more powerful, that was kind of perceived as Fi or Assassin in the last set, that people would often have like 4 heroes, 4 people drafting, and so you have this 4-2-2-2 split. Now, with something like Monarch, when you have 4 heroes are pretty balanced in this format, and often you're going to end up with a 2-2-2-2 split. So 2 of every class / hero represented in your Monarch draft is going to be pretty common. But if you can find your way into that one person seat, maybe you're the one Levia drafter or the one Boltyn drafter, whatever it might be, you can find yourself in a really good spot. And often, there will be like 3 prisms, 3 or 5, 3 of a class 5 light hero drafters is not uncommon in this format. So you can often find yourself, position yourself in your seat well, be in a pretty good deck. But it's not the end of the world if you end up in like a 3 Prism or 3 Boltyn, to be honest, or even 3 Chane. I really never want to be personally a 3 Brute drafter, and I kind of want to avoid it in Chane. I also want to avoid it in Boltyn, to be honest. But Prism, I think you can kind of get away with it a lot more. So that's kind of one of the first key differences I wanted to talk about. Now, I could go on about the 3 versus 4 hero draft format for ages. Even in Singapore, I chatted to James White, and he said, you should do a pod on this. You should talk about the differences between 3 and 4 hero draft sets. And you know what? We might just do that in the near future. Other differences is sort of the power level of the set. This set is it has quite a high power level, but it's really synergy based. So your cards working together to form these really powerful combat chains, or to do quite powerful things with the interactions they have. You see this a lot with Boltyn in particular. The way your axes interact with your hero ability and his ability to go wide on massive combat chains. See this with Levia, with Blood Dead and 6 powers, to make sure you can actually continue to keep yourself alive and push through damage to your opponent. Prism, of course, with just how light cards work and illusionist cards work. So a lot of synergy in this format, but it is also quite powerful, as opposed to some sets where, they were fast, like Uprising, really fast format and reasonably powerful, but This format is slower than that and more synergy based, but with higher sort of power levels. Interestingly, the defensive value of the set is quite low. You have a lot of no blocks, you have a lot of instants that don't block, you have like a reasonable amount of cards that do defend too, but there are some really good defensive cards. And also, one of the other key differences in this set is equipment is really, really powerful. Not to say it's not good in other sets, but it's really powerful in Monarch. So something to really keep in mind is that generally equipment is a bit higher drafted in this set than some of the other sets, kind of on the aggregate. And some of the equipment is really top tier. Some of the equipment you even want to make sure you have if you're going to be in archetypes, which we'll talk about once we get into the heroes. So power level, synergy, defensive value, 3 and 4 heroes. The last big difference is 15 cards. Now, this actually makes quite a lot of difference. In Uprising and Outsiders, you have 14 card packs. You have an extra card per pack, and that means extra 3 playables, effectively, or 3 cards you're going to draft over the draft can actually make a massive difference, especially in a format where sometimes you actually want to play more than 30 cards because of fatigue, especially if you're in a hero like Chane. Also gives you the ability to draft sideboard cards, which is really cool. So I really like the 15 card draft format versus the 14 card draft format, and I think it's something to really keep in mind when you get into the Monarch draft format. Next up, I want to talk a little bit about some of the key things in the Monarch draft format that you should have top of mind, or you should kind of know about if you are going to be drafting this set. So first of all, just backing onto what I said about the differences between previous sets and this set is just speed of the format. This is not the fastest format out there. Now, there can be some exceptions to this, especially when it comes to just kind of what I'd call like snowball damage. You can really have these really crazy snowball games based on just kind of rolling into your best damage hands. Now, I would say like a lot of the time your decks are going to feel like half really powerful, half kind of filler and role players. But sometimes you're just going to draw that powerful half of your deck where your opponent is, and it's really important to have the cards to combat this. So I'll use an example. Prism with Heralds. You know, these Heralds are really above rate. If they're able to like, you know, play a bunch of Spears of Surreality to get go again, plus really efficient Heralds that have on hits that get them Spectral Shields, like red Herald of Protection or red Wartune Herald that's really resource efficient, they can kind of just run away with the game if you don't have something like a Popper. The flip side of that, you know, if you're playing into something like Chane and they kind of just go off in these first couple of turns with really big, you know, they hit their shackles, they get their kind of non-attack actions and their attack actions plus some ways to get go again, and they can really pop like 1 or 2 big turns. You need good defensive cards that can kind of stop that and pull the game back for you a little bit so you can stay in it. So it's kind of what I call like snowball damage. It can happen in this format. And that's one of the reasons I didn't think I liked Monarch, but the more and more I play it, I think there's ways to mitigate as the opponent, you know, your opponent's snowball damage. So I've kind of come around the speed of the format. But yeah, it can sometimes be quick, but a lot of the time it's going to feel somewhere kind of in between Uprising and Outsiders. Often the games aren't as grindy as some of the Outsiders games, but at the same time, you know, 2 or 3 turn Uprising games aren't what you're going to see in Monarch. Some of the other key things, talents and how they impact drafts. So one of the key things in the set, you know, is that we have talents, class cards, and then generics. And those talent cards are going to help to keep you open during the draft. I'll talk a little bit about that some more at the end of the video when I talk about tips and tricks. This video is fully chapterized, so you can go if you want to skip some of these. Maybe these tips aren't relevant to you. Maybe you just want to learn about a hero. If you don't have any interest in the shadow heroes, only the light heroes, you can skip down to the chapters in this video. But yeah, when it comes to talents, one of the things that talents really help you to do in this format, what makes it so interesting, is they can keep you open in the draft. You might take some really powerful equipment and generics in the first couple of picks. Then, you know, you take a shadow card, and then you take a brute card, and you can still be pretty open. It's like, okay, maybe I don't want that brute card. That's only 1 card. I can walk away from that, but I've still got these, you know, the shadow card. I take another shadow card, then all of a sudden Chane's open, and I've still got every card but 1 that's playable in my deck because the shadow, the talent, they can flit in. So, you know, you don't really just immediately narrow in on a hero. You can actually go like, stay open, go into a talent, and then go into a class/hero from there. So quite an interesting way that Monarch works. Pack distribution. We've got to talk pack distribution because it is very interesting. So the way pack distribution works in Monarch, again, 15 cards, is it's a little bit easier to it's a bit more consistency compared to some sets like Uprising, for instance. So in every pack, you're going to have this breakdown. You're going to have 3 of the light class cards. So this means you're going to have 3 Boltyn or Prism cards. They could be light illusionist cards. They could be illusionist cards. They could be light warrior cards. They could be warrior cards, for instance. You're going to have 3 of those. And then and any makeups. You could have 2 Prism, 1 Boltyn, for instance. You could have, but you always have a 2-1 split. You always have minimum in each pack 1 Prism or 1 Boltyn card, whether they're illusionist or light illusionist. Then same on the flip side of Shadow. You're going to have 3 cards of Shadow hero cards. So not talent cards, those come in a second. So not Shadow or Light we're talking about here. We're talking about specifically tied to a class. So you could have, again, you could have a Shadow Brute card, you might just have a Brute card, you might have a Shadow Chane card, Shadow Runeblade card rather, or just a Runeblade card. So that's going to be in that configuration, and these are all at common. So these first 6 cards are all common, and they're split evenly 3 and 3 between light and shadow heroes. Then next we have 5 cards, and these are generic / talent. You're going to have between 0 to 5 talent cards, so light or shadow, not class cards, remember, 0 to 5 generics, but they're going to total up to 5. That's the next 5 slots in this pack. So you could have a 3-2 split between generic and talent. You could have a 4-1 split between generic and talent. You could have a 5-0 split between generic and talent. It is completely random, but more commonly you see kind of like a bit of a rough split of like 3-2, 4-1, etc. So that is something to keep an eye on. The numbers of light versus shadow are pretty even as well. After that, so that's 11 cards. Then we go into our equipment, the one piece of equipment there. And then you're going to have your foil. So this is your foil slot, depending on whether you're playing with first edition or unlimited. So always going to be your rainbow foil slot there. And then we have our rare. So always guaranteed 1 rare in the pack, and then 1 rare or higher. So total of 2 rares, but 1 will always be rare and 1 could be rare or higher. So majestic, for instance. And then you've got your token in the pack as well. So it's actually 16 cards, but 15 playable cards there in the pack. And if you're playing with first edition packs, then that can be, you've got a cold foil slot potentially there as well. So that's what the pack distribution looks like. Something really important to remember, and I'll talk about tips on how you can utilize the pack distribution as we get later into the video. Anything else? I want to talk about shadow versus light and kind of what that means when it comes to drafting. There's kind of this perception that the shadow heroes are harder to draft than the light heroes, and I think that is kind of true. Particularly Chane and Levia require deck management and understanding kind of, you're not just managing your life total and sort of cards turn to turn, you're also managing your deck as a resource a little bit. So shadow is a little bit harder to play, but I think once you get the reps in, it's not too bad. The Majestics and Rares in this set are really good. There's a lot of bombs actually at Majestic level and even Rare level, so it is important to sort of look at those cards when you open the pack, because some of those cards are really, really good, whereas in some sets like Uprising, the Rares are often not that great, so it's a bit of a difference there as well. Game and card management is really important in this format because of things like fatigue is a possibility for Chane, even Levia, even Prism because you don't have a weapon, as well as just kind of what we talked about before with, banishing the shackles when you're playing as Chane, banishing your graveyard and trying to keep your life total up by triggering Levia's hero ability, and even Boltyn a little bit. You're kind of managing the game a little bit with more so tempo actually, when you kind of let your opponent sort of swing back at you and when you try to use your whole hand versus not. So it's actually quite hard to use your full hand in this game if you're not using some cards on defense. But Boltyn can kind of get away with that more than other heroes. Let's talk heroes in Monarch Draft. What they do, what you should be doing to draft them, key cards you should be looking for, and what archetypes you should be trying to build or game plans you should be going after. Now, first up, we're going to start with the light side, and we're going to go Prism. Prism, probably the most popular, or, the one that people gravitate towards a bit more, I think, in Monarch Draft than maybe perhaps the other 3 heroes. And, for good reason. Obviously, it's a hero that had a lot of success in Classic Constructed. Equal maybe with Chane in terms of the most success. Obviously, living legend now for Prism. And also just has this kind of, I think, playstyle with above rate heralds that can really pay you off and maybe be a bit more easier to navigate than some of the shadow counterparts to Prism. So Prism's power level really does come a lot in these above rate attacks in the form of these heralds and cards like Enigma Chimera, Pairs of Surreality, for instance, these Phantasm attacks, but also has great defensive value and has this ability to soak up incidental damage with things like Spectral Shield, some of the good equipment you have access to, and your class cards for the most part, apart from the non-attack actions, defending for 3. So with Iris, you can get a lot of value out of these shields. You can have this kind of cool game plan with shields as well. So there's kind of 2 key archetypes, I think, in Prism now. I think there's sort of nuance to this, and maybe there's 3 or 4, but the 2 key ones that I want to talk about, if you're getting into Monarch Draft for the first time, is idea of a herald kind of beatdown or herald focused strategy, and then this more value defensive orientated build. Those are the 2 kind of key ones that I think you should be focused on if you're looking to play Prism in Monarch Draft. So let's talk about the sort of herald beatdown. Now, this is all about drafting cards with great bottom left numbers, these heralds of protection, these Fortune heralds, these heralds of triumph, tenacity, and basically being able to do things like 2-card block and then come in with an above rate attack on your opponent's on your turn that threatens an on-hit effect. Now, majority of the on-hit effects are going to be put this into your soul, which is still a really good on-hit. That's going to allow you to create shields for late game and kind of chip your opponent down once maybe you get through some heralds, or maybe if they have a popper by using your shield, or allowing you to use your 4 or 5 card hands if you swing tempo by being able to attack with a shield, get go again, and then attack with a herald. So getting cards into soul is actually really, really key. The other thing as well is also the on-hit effect that comes with the card. And this is where the pecking order of heralds starts to come in. Herald protection is far and away that number one. It's the most important. It is the, it can provide value on face value. It's a 2 for 8, right, with that shield. But it's so much more than that because of what that shield can represent to you. Plus, you get a card in soul. So 2 for 9 is, like a 2-card 9 is almost what Herald of Protection at red is. So that card is really, really key. I think next is your Herald of Triumph, Bears of Surreality, and your War Tune. War Tune, because of the resource efficiency, is really, really good. When you get these Orchid kind of all-red hands, you can still come in with a really strong threat in War Tune. Those are kind of, I think, the pecking order of some of the best ones. But all of the red heralds are really good. Even the yellows and the blues are good because you want a decent amount of blues in Prism. I'll sort of talk about this at the end, but I like sort of having around like 10 to 14 blues in Prism. Especially the more if you're going to be on this more defensive value build that revolves around attacking with shields with Iris that we're going to talk about. But even in a build that's more herald focused, I still want a lot of blues and good heralds. And they're threats if you draw them. They defend for 3. And they can put cards into your soul. So basically all the heralds are particularly good. Outside of that, if you're looking to kind of build this deck, I think the other cards that are really important to you are things like Seek Enlightenment, Pump Spell, and look for some poppers for the mirror are really important. Now on the value build side, that's more sort of defensive. You're really focused around auras in particular. So you do still want to have some heralds for sure, don't get me wrong, but you're focused around cards like Ode to Wrath, Parable of Humility, Merciful, even is okay. It's the worst of the 3 rare auras. Now, picking up one of these in the draft to put into this kind of style deck is really important. One of the ways you can beat Levia, it's a sticky weapon, as Brendan Patrick likes to call it, plus Spectral Shield builds. So you want cards that are going to get cards into your soul. So things like Red Illuminate or Invigorating Light, like these cards that can put cards into your soul plus some heralds. Prismatic Shield in particular is a really good sort of way to gain a lot of value. You can play that card on turn 0. Immediately you've got 3 Spectral Shields, or late game, once you can kind of swing tempo, it's really hard for your opponent to kill them. If you're able to block with 2 cards and come in with 2 shields, you can really chip them down that way. So that's quite important. With this value build, this is where I like the more sort of higher blue count. Like I say, I do want some number of heralds, particularly blue heralds, because I want a higher blue count. Some key light cards I think that are important to keep in mind for either of these 2 strategies. They're going to keep you open. Maybe you don't want to immediately commit to prison. I wouldn't recommend immediately forcing a hero in this set. I think you can get really punished for it, because of what I talked about earlier with that kind of 2-2-2 split. You end up in 3 Prism, it's not the worst, but if you end up in 4 because you forced it, that can just be awful, especially because there's going to be there's going to be 2 heroes that have 1 represented of each of them, probably. So they're going to have really powerful decks. There's some key cards I think can keep you open and then put you into either Prism or Boltyn in particular. Cards like Halo of Illumination, the equipment, the headpiece, really strong in Prism, but also good in Boltyn. Invigorating Light red, popper, but also this card that can get you things into soul, get itself into soul. Illuminate red, 0 for 4. People know how good Snatch is. Illuminate is kind of similar in this format. Seek Enlightenment red. So then there's some tech cards that I think are important to keep in mind when you're drafting Prism. These are more sideboard cards, but they are important. One is Blinding Beam, really good into Levia. They have a lot of poppers in the deck. Especially if you're in the hero strategy, you need some number of Blinding Beams to make sure you can push through damage, push through your on-hit effects when it comes to that Levia matchup. The next is Impenetrable Belief. Really good against Chane in particular, this card, but also pretty reasonable against Levia because you get this block 4, which is a big number in the bottom right-hand corner, pretty hard to get in this format. The last is Glisten. This is a card that I think is particularly good in the value build, but can be a bit of a liability into some of the matchups like Chane, where you need to be blocking a bit more because of the 0 defense. But in the kind of more grindy matchups, the Prism Mirror, even against Levia, this card can be an absolute MVP, especially in red. Now, next up, for all you Warrior stands out there, let's talk about Boltyn, the tall Timmy's favorite hero. At least I think it's his favorite hero. Boltyn is particularly interesting, I think, in Monarch Draft because I actually think, all the heroes are pretty unique. Boltyn has this kind of interesting play style because it can actually utilize 5 and 4 card hands the best, I think, of any of the heroes in the set, alongside maybe Chane, but I think Boltyn's a bit more straightforward to do it. However, Boltyn has some really key cards that I think you need in the deck. Now, rather than there being kind of different archetypes with Boltyn, I think you can either be a bit more like weapon focused or you can be a bit more attack action focused. And some of the cards will differ that you want depending on whether you're weapon focused or whether you are attack action focused. But whether you're weapon or attack action focused, basically what you want is a good number of kind of payoff cards. And payoff cards are things that people overlook a lot, I think, when it comes to Boltyn. They really focus on these charge cards, particularly these red charge cards. And honestly, these red charge cards are fine, but they're not high, really, really high picks, and you don't want an insane amount of them in your deck. You don't want half your deck to be red charge cards because ultimately they're card disadvantage. People look at Bolt of Courage, great card. It's a 0 for 3. It can get the buff when you charge with your hero ability if they block with an attack action, and it on hit draws a card. Great. That costs you 2 cards. Let's compare that to a card like Snatch. Yes, it's a great card. It's a 0 for 4 with on hit draw a card, but it costs you 1 card, not 2 cards. And yes, Bolt of Courage does get you that all important card into your soul. Don't need that many cards in your soul. You just want enough to have enough good big payoff turns and leverage your payoff cards like Valiant Thrust. This is a particularly important card, I think, or at least it's a really good payoff card. You have to have it to have a successful Boltyn deck, but it is a really good payoff card. And these are some of the cards that you are looking for ultimately to make sure that you have a well-rounded and good Boltyn deck and not just jam it full of specifically charged cards. So in that regard, when it comes to maybe the more attack action focused build, or even, to be honest, the weapon build, because you do still want charge cards, I'm looking for a couple of good red charge cards. Bolt of Courage, Express Lightning, Engulfing Light. But then, actually having some in like blue or even yellow, just so you can charge a card when you need to on an off turn, is actually still perfectly reasonable and means that you can, draft other cards that have payoff higher and then get some of these cards later on in the draft. So cards like Valiant Thrust, Fear the Vanguard. If you see this card, it is a absolute bomb in the set. And of course, it's a pack one, pick one. And if you get that card in your Boltyn deck, you're well on your way to having a very strong Boltyn deck. Same with Gallantry Gold. Gallantry Gold, if I don't have a Gallantry Gold in my Boltyn deck, I'm pretty upset, to be honest. I think it's a card that leverages you to have some really big turns, but also it can turn one single blue to 7 damage with a card from Soul. Because you pitch, you activate Gallantry Gold, you come with the first weapon for 3, give it go again, second weapon for 4. That's, a 1 card 7 is what you want to be doing when you're kind of on the back foot, maybe take some tempo. So Boltyn can always threaten to kind of swing tempo, which is great with Gallantry Gold. Of course, it also blocks for 1. But without it, I think your deck is often quite a bit worse. So Gallantry Gold, I have really high in my pick order. And of course, Fear the Vanguard, because that card is just ridiculous. But yeah, other payoff cards, we've already talked about Valiant Thrust Red. Yellow's even fine. Battlefield Blitz is a pretty reasonable card. Some of the cards for the more weapon-based version. So if you're going for the weapon-based version, you want pumps to be able to put onto your weapons. So Second Swing is really good for that. Pumps in general are really good though. So Warmonger's Recital, Seek Enlightenment, especially in red for both of those, are really important cards. They're going to enable you to make sure you can put a pump on your attack. There's the Tall Timmy, again referencing the Tall Timmy because we're talking about Boltyn. He likes to call them front pumps. But these mean that, if you come with your Bolt of Courage, often if you're playing like a 4 or 5 card hand, you come in with a charge card. Your opponent can just say, okay, well, no blocks. And then your turn's over because there's no plus attack on it for you to activate Boltyn's hero ability. But if you've got a pump, a Seek Enlightenment, or a Warmonger's Recital, or even a Minnowism Belittle, also really great in Boltyn, then that enables you to make sure you can activate that hero ability and continue with your massive chain. The other card I haven't talked about yet, but is up there, it's probably like Fear the Vanguard, and then Take Flight, I think. Take Flight Red in particular is very, very strong, but all the colors of Take Flight, they enable you to just have more efficient turns, because with all these other charge cards, you have to then banish the card from Soul to get go again. Whereas with Take Flight, you get the card in Soul as part of the cost, present some damage, and then you get to come in with your weapons afterwards. So a lot of sort of what Take Flight allows you to do is to play like really good 3-card hands that can present sort of minimum 5, 6, 7 damage, and use even a Soul card to go against one of your weapons if your opponent blocks it and gives it that pump. And these zero sort of red ones that we talked about before, these 0 cost charge cards, aren't as apt at doing that. So I think, yeah, make sure if you see Take Flights, those are really high priority, especially red. Those in Fear the Vanguard are much, very much the top sort of picks that you're looking for when it comes to drafting Boltyn. All right, next up, we've got to head to the shadow side of the equation when it comes to Monarch and talk about Chane and Levia. Let's start off with Chane. Chane, of course, living legend in Classic Constructed, but when it comes to draft, it looks a little bit different. It's still very powerful. It's still all about that Banish Zone, about those Soul Shackles, about those sort of, explosive combat chains and arcane damage. Now, Monarch's quite interesting in the fact that we have no arcane barrier. So arcane damage is a really good version of what you might call evasion or reach, this way to deal damage that's really hard to stop, that can get you over the top, get you across the line when it comes to kind of finishing or closing out a game. Arcane damage can be super potent. So arcane damage for Chane, really powerful part of what Chane can do. There's kind of 2 particular ways. This is a common theme with the heroes in the set, at least for this video. I'm kind of focusing on 2 of the kind of higher level divergences in strategy and the ways you can draft these decks when it comes to this kind of video. Chane, you can go down a more arcane focus route, or I think you can go down this more kind of aggressive, just pure aggro, banish into gas kind of route. That one relies on a lot more sort of things like chain extenders, go again cards, and generics, or just powerful generics, good attacks. And the other one, this arcane, that's all about what it is: drafting cards that say arcane damage on them. Good sort of defensive cards. You can actually kind of go a little bit longer and a little bit grindier with that version, as opposed to just kind of like pedal to the middle, just pure aggro from the other Chane side. So one of the key things, no matter which version you're playing of Chane, it is all about managing your deck. Those cards in your deck, whether it be 30 or to 36 cards, which I think you often want to play more than 30 cards, depending on the build and the matchup you're in. But if you think your opponent's going to try and fatigue you, you're often wanting to play more than 30, especially if you have more than 30 good cards. I wouldn't recommend just stretching and playing cards that are bad, especially if they're just going to be sort of dead cards when you draw them. They block twos that do nothing, for instance. But there's opportunities to play more cards. Now, it is about deck management, because going to be every time you create a soul shackle to get going and extend that chain, if you aren't making use of that soul shackle to push some damage or threaten, to take cards out of your opponent's hand so they can't come back you with their game plan and present damage, it's kind of a waste. It's not doing what you want to do, because it's going to create another card that goes into banish that, if you don't have a really, really high blood deck count, is just going to be cards lost from your deck. That's going to be damage lost from your deck. Think about your 30 to 36 cards you're presenting as having a terminal velocity or a max amount of damage that you can present out of those cards. And every non-blood deck card that you banish away, you're losing that, especially if you banish away really powerful red cards. So you want to make sure that any soul shackles you make are super impactful. So one of the keys to drafting and playing Chane is understanding what your turn-to-turn is going to look like from your combat chains. And that's why it's really quite easy often to just draft the best cards that say Blood Dead on them. So red blood deck cards like Bounding Demigod, Riftbind, Seeds of Agony, Howl from Beyond is one of the best cards you can draft for Shadow. I think it's maybe the best Shadow card in the set. You can focus on these cards, and that means that, when you banish them, they're just great hits that you can play. Rift Through Reality, Chain Extenders, Go Again. And then just cards that are just good generic cards. So, and these are cards that say Go Again on them when it comes to Chane. So Brandish Red, Belittle Red, Warmonger's Recital, these pumps. These are the kind of cards that can be really, really beneficial. When it comes to that arcane damage side, again, those cards that say arcane damage on them are obviously really important. Something like Rip Through Reality, which also gets Go Again off arcane, so you can go wide. Non-attack actions that have arcane on them, so Seeds, of course. But things like Vixing Malice, that is a really, really high priority pick. To be honest, no matter what Chane deck you're building, but even like the blue and yellow version's really, really good for your arcane damage. Rifted Torment, again, great card when it comes to that arcane damage kind of build. So that's kind of what you're looking to do when it comes to Chane. You want a high blood deck count. You want just a really good number of non-attack actions as well. Pumps are great because you can't have all your cards having Go Again, so it allows you to utilize your hand, especially in this attack version, this kind of like more explosive version. You're basically never defending, so you want to be able to use your 5-card hands for just maximum damage, and they kind of this kind of exponential value on some cards, and pumps really help with that because can't have all Go Again cards. Blood debt, I like to have around like 50% of my deck as blood debt, kind of a minimum, and I want those cards to be really impactful. Some of these like yellow blood debt cards, they can be really low impact, even some of the blue ones. Blue Piercing Shadow Vice, for instance, that was a really good blue. So is things like Blue Seeds, for instance, whereas Blue Riftbind is a much less exciting card to be banishing. So I want a lot of my blood debt cards to be red, then some good blues is helpful. Seeping Shadows is a great blue blood debt card, for instance. Let's talk about, I guess, some of the key cards for aggro. I mean, again, just Brandish, Belittle, Bounding Demigod, Riftbind, Pumps, Warmonger's Recital, Minimalism. Belittle Minimalism is a really high sort of priority for that more explosive build. Going back to that arcane damage build, Rifted Torments, Seeds of Agony, Vixing Malice, Crackles, Rip Through Realities. These cards in particular are really powerful and the sort of cards you want to make sure you can utilize that arcane damage but get the most out of your return on investment on the arcane damage. When it comes to equipment, you want the chest piece if you can get it. 8th Ironweave, it's really, really strong no matter the build, but even Blood Drop Brocade, just resources and cheating on resources really helps you in these Chane builds because of the fact that you get to play extra cards from Banish. And then, other than that, I think the sort of other key card is like Time Skippers, because I actually like a reasonably high number of blues in my Chane deck. I like somewhere between like 7 to 11 blues, and I like to be on that higher side, especially if I have cards like Time Skippers, or I have ways to utilize a blue every turn. I want to have a higher blue count. That's what Chane looks like in this format. I think it is, it can be a little bit hard to navigate. I don't think it's the hardest to draft, especially if you focus on one of those two things and just focus on some of those core things I just talked about. Blood deck cards, non-attack actions, cards that say Go Again, and kind of just ignore the filler as much as possible. Last but certainly not least, when it comes to the heroes of Monarch Draft, it is Levia, the Shadow Brute, hero that is getting a lot of attention right now with Dust or Dawn, but we're talking Monarch here, and probably one of my favorite heroes to draft in this format. I seem to find myself in Levia quite a lot, a little bit biased, but I think it's just because it's super fun to play. Quite hard to draft, I think, and quite hard to play. It might be the hardest hero to draft and play in Monarch Draft, but I think once you kind of get the fundamentals down and kind of nail them, it's super rewarding, and I think it's maybe the most underdrafted. It actually reminds me a little bit of drafting Dromai in Uprising. People kind of sometimes want to stay away from it because they think it can be a bit harder to play. You can kind of get punished by good sort of aggressive decks like Chane or Boltyn kind of punishing you, and they're not wrong, but I think overall Levia can just be a ton of fun to play. So some key things about Levia I want to go through first. Blood Debt is scary, and it should be with Levia. You really need to focus on Blood Debt and what the Blood Debt cards that you're banishing are going to do to you. To trigger that ability for like 5-6 turns in a row is really, really difficult. So often the kind of traditional game plan you want to follow with Levia is like in thirds. It goes in thirds. The first third of the game is about setting up and just presenting good trade hands. So this means, blocking with 2 cards, coming in with a threat, filling up your graveyard with some 6 attacks, and then finding like a good power card to arsenal ready for the mid game. This could be something like a Dread Screamer, for instance, or an Unworldly Bellows, or even like a Writhing Beast Hulk red. Cards that kind of have like quite a high, or Endless Maw have quite a high ceiling. And then at some point you're going to get towards that mid game, and you're going to find a point where either you have just like a really good hand that can go wide or utilize your cards in your hand really well, or your opponent's kind of going to have an off turn, and then you're going to press the button. And by press the button, what I mean is you're going to start the count. You're going to start to banish cards into your banish zone, which then is going to start this like looming threat of Blood Debt killing you. So at that point, you need to be in a really good position. Either your deck is just full of gas because you've pitched stuff early or set stuff up early, and you've got a good stockpile in your graveyard of cards with 6 attack, or cards you can play from banish like Howl from Beyond, Ghostly Visit, etc. And also maybe ideally your opponent is on low life. I like to try in that first third of the game get my opponent below like 15 life. But if your deck is powerful enough, once you kind of hit the go button and you just start banishing and presenting all these threats, you can often just kill your opponent if your deck's really powerful, especially depending on the number of Dread Screamers you have, Voltions from the Bellows of Howl with the Dominate effect, Writhing Beast Hulk with the Dominate effect. There's what you want, similar to we talked about Arcane Damage and Chane when it comes to Levia, is you want reach, you want this evasion, and that comes in the form of Dominate for Levia. That's what you really need to have. A couple of cards for sort of in-game finishes. So, those Convulsions, the Writhing Beast Hulks, the Consuming, these are the kind of cards that can really help you. So I think one of the key things when it comes to drafting Levia is focus on good, efficient attacks is kind of your #1 priority. So yeah, there's the blingy cards like Dread Screamer and Endless Maw. Yes, those cards are very, very good and you should take those cards. But next under that is just good damage cards. Don't get too caught up on too many sort of these Graveling Growls and Hungering Slaughter Beast. These cards are good to have in some number, but what you really want is cards like Deadwood Rumbler. Red Deadwood Rumbler is such a high pick for me because it's a 2-card 8 that can, in the late game, if I need it to, banish a card to still trigger my Levia ability while still presenting good damage. And in the early game, it just helps me trade. Like I said, block with 2 cards that defend for maybe total of 5. Having 2-3 blocks is kind of hard in this format. Defend for 5 and then come in for 8. That's still net 13. I'm still positive that kind of average of 12 damage. So Smash the Big Tree is another one, particularly red, but yellow is also good. Help just trade damage. And then, again, block with 2 cards, Smash the Big Tree. That's a good way to play the first couple of turns of the game. After that, I'm kind of making sure that I don't have too many no blocks in my deck. There is a lot of no blocks in Brute, and this defensive value of Monarch overall can be quite low. So I definitely want to make sure that any no blocks or cards with 0 defense in my deck that I have, they're really impactful on offense. So if they're not impactful on offense and they don't defend, I don't want them in my deck. So some of these instants, some of like a blue Smash the Big Tree, I don't want that in my deck. But a yellow Smash the Big Tree, red Smash the Big Tree, red Deadwood Rumbler, for instance, Pulping Red. These are cards I do want in my deck. That's where I want to utilize my no blocks. Some of the ways you can help offset that, though, is having cards like Ironhides. So having a couple of Ironhide, along with probably one of the most important cards you want to make sure you draft in Fire, which is Hooves of the Shadow Beast. You want to make sure you definitely have Hooves. But then beyond that, the next kind of equipment I'm looking for is a couple of pieces of Ironhide. So I can turn awkwardly when I have my no block hands, I can turn those into things that can defend so that I'm not just completely dead or having dead cards in my hand effectively. We talked about kind of the thirds game plan, the first third being the setup, the middle third being the kind of turning point where you press the button, and then the final third is where you present like this evasion or lethal damage with Dominate, or just like so much power that you kind of overwhelm, or you die to your Blood Debt. Try and avoid that one if you can. Not good. That's kind of what that looks like. So second cycle can actually be really important in Levia. Our favorite thing on Arsenal Pass, talking about second cycle, but it's actually super relevant in Levia in this format because you can pitch threats early, trade damage in the early game. You can block quite a lot actually with Levia in the early game, and then once you're kind of set up ready to press that button, like I said, now you get through to your second cycle and you have a lot of threats. You want to have at least like 50% of your deck is like 6 attacks, I think. Well, at least like if a 30 card deck, you want at least like 12 to 13. I think that's really minimum number of 6 attacks because one, those are going to be the cards that you then attack with and then banish, and so you don't want to be whiffing on your banishes, missing on 6 attacks when you play cards like Dread Screamer. They also just good damage. But then the third thing is there are also poppers for Prism, which is also actually super relevant, especially the ones that obviously can block. So make sure you've got those cards in your deck. Let's talk about some other key cards that you want to make sure that you are drafting. So Dread Screamer red, Chane extenders like Brandish. Seek Horizon is a really great card in red that I like in Fire, and Unworldly Bellows. One of my favorite things to do with a card like Brandish or even Seek Horizon is like pitch my blue, come in with my Brandish, and then with my weapon, I'm threatening potentially up to 9 damage with just those 2 cards. That's massive. It's a huge 2-card hand. But even Seek Horizon on like a 3-card hand, it's like, okay, play my Seek Horizon, put my 6 attack on top that I want to discard with my Meat Axe, and then pitch my 3rd card, come in with my Meat Axe, so 4 damage plus 5 damage, 9 damage with 3 cards is still pretty good for trading in the early game. Plus Seek Horizon is just a card that's a 0 for 4, so quite high on my priority list. We talked about evasion, these dominate cards, Convulsions from the Bellows of Hell, Writhing Beast Hulk. You want some number of those good just damage cards like Smashed Victory Red, Deadwood Rumbler, even the generics like Stony Wootenhog and stuff, good in that spot. Endless Maw is a complete and utter bomb. If you see that card and you're in Levia, make sure you take it. 2-card 9 is amazing. Who's the Shadow Beast? You want that. Some number of Ironhide. And then cards to play from Banish. You can actually loop these cards. So something like a Hell from Beyond, you can just continually loop this card. It's like, play my Hell from Beyond from my hand and then banish it with my my attack, my Boneyard Marauder, for instance. Next turn, play it again. Do the same thing again with a Hungering Slaughter Beast, for instance. Keep recurring that Hell from Beyond is great value. Do the same with Ghostly Visit or Void Wraith, especially on turns where you come in with something like a Dread Screamer. Dread Screamer in all colors is really good, worth noting. And Hungering Slaughter Beast, Graveling Growl, having some number of these cards is good. They're relevant, but I think they're just lower priority. So that is Levia for me. That is the last hero we talk about in this Monarch draft. Now we're going to finish up with some tips and tricks when it comes to drafting Monarch. So the last thing I want to leave you with in this crash course intro to Monarch drafting is just some key tips and tricks to make sure you get the most out of your drafts, and kind of give you some key takeaways, some things that you can walk into front of mind when it comes to how to get that 3-0 or that 2-1 in your pod for whatever it might be. So first of all is how to make the most of staying open and what staying open looks like in Monarch draft, as opposed to some formats like Uprising or Outsiders, where I think you could get rewarded for forcing sometimes, but committing reasonably early because of 14 card versus 15 card packs and 3 hero versus 4 heroes. I think you get more rewarded for staying open Monarch on the flip side. So how do you actually stay open in Monarch? Well, you have your generics. Obviously, they can keep you really open. And then you have your talent cards, which keep you open to 2 heroes still. And then, of course, then you can move into your class-specific cards and commit to a hero from there. So generics, for the most part, keep you open. So generics like Surging Militia, Warmonger's Recital, these cards keep you really open. There's some generics that are more specific to heroes. I think Brandish is a good example. That card's really good, but in Prism, it's much less impactful than it is in Levia or Chane or even Boltyn, for example. So some generics can be a bit more class or talent specific, and that's worth noting. And then, of course, talent cards, they keep you open to a light card to Prism or Boltyn, for instance. Don't be afraid, though, to take class cards, powerful class cards, because even if you don't play them, they're just one card. So let's say you're 6 picks in, you've taken 3 generics and 2 light cards, and then a Prism card is in their pool as well. Maybe you took a 3rd pick like Red Spirit of Protection. That card is super powerful. Even if you don't end up in Prism, it's a reasonable card to hedge on. Because if you do end up in Prism, that card's going to be one of the best cards in your deck. Now, if it turns out that, Boltyn ends up being open for you and you move into a Boltyn draft seat, that's fine. You wasted only 1 pick. You still get these other 2 light cards that are going to go into your deck. And that's why they're kind of keeping open and using the light and the generic cards can be really beneficial. Now, you don't want to stay open too long and you don't want to just pass up good cards. If good class cards are coming your way, if I see something like a 4th pick or 3rd pick Red Hero Protection, or, 2nd pick via the Vanguard, for instance, I'm taking these cards, a 4th pick Red Dread Screamer, whatever it might be. I'm going to pick up these cards because to me, that is a signal that that is open. You know, my opponent is past that. They know they've passed that card, and now I'm going to start to take those cards. Now I might, you know, they might end up being in Brute. Maybe I take a 4th pick Red Dread Screamer. They took a really good Shadow card, and then 5th pick, they're like, oh, here's a really good Brute card. It's the best card in the pack. I'm going to move into Brute. That's fine. I've only, you know, used 1 pick because I've prioritized my Shadow cards and my generic cards, for instance. So, important to remember that, and this kind of idea of staying open and what hedging looks like is something that I could talk about for ages, but that's kind of the top level when it comes to Monarch. Let's talk about a few sort of other small things. Reading signals. We talked about the pack distribution at the start of the draft, and one of the ways that you can actually read signals, so what is your opponent taking, is in those first 2 groups of slots, which is basically the hero slots. So we talked about you get 3 light hero cards and 3 shadow hero cards, not talent, remember. And there's always going to be a 2-1 split. So pack 1, pick 1, you take, I don't know, whatever, it doesn't matter, but your opponent passes your pack. You're looking at the 14 cards, you sort them, and you look at those front 6 cards. There's only 5 cards, and there's a light card, a light hero card missing. And there's 2 Prism cards in the pack. Well, you know they've taken a Boltyn card. There's no way they could have taken anything else. A Boltyn, a light warrior, or a warrior card was in that slot and it's now been taken. So knowing pack distribution can give you a leg up pretty early in terms of reading signals and understanding what the people to your right in pack 1 are doing. It's actually really, really relevant. Non-attack actions for Boltyn. Draft some non-attack actions for Boltyn so that you can block with them and not trigger their Boltyn hero ability. It's not the be-all and end-all, but when you get the opportunity to have some of these, they are really, really good. Like sometimes I'm like, okay, looking at my sideboard and my Levia deck, and I have this like yellow Convulsions the Bellows Howl. The card's fine. I don't really want the yellow. I want like the red or the blue. But I have this yellow one that's kind of floating around as like an additional card. I might just play it because it blocks for effectively 4 against Boltyn in a lot of situations. You can often fatigue Chane. It's really important to understand what your game plan is against Chane. Are you trying to trade cards with them and kill them via damage? Or are you going to try and fatigue them? Often, fatiguing Chane is like a default plan because they have a lot of damage. Like they have a lot of power. Like they can outvalue you in the damage sort of portion of the game if you try and trade damage with them. But you might just be able to run them out of cards and run damage. You know, Soul Shackles and banishing really important cards. But if the deck's super powerful, that might be a bit harder. Hold a card in Soul as late as possible when you're playing as Prism. You don't want to just be like banishing your cards from Soul as you go through the game and not giving yourself Soul for the end of the game, because later and later you go into the game, the harder it is for your opponent to kill your shields because they can't just sacrifice life to come back, kill your shields. Because once they get down to a low life total, now they have to start like blocking with cards on your attacks and then coming in with less damage so that you can basically block with cards and keep your shields alive. So you want to make sure you have like minimum a card in your Soul for like the end game, particularly in the Prism mirrors, but almost any game you're playing as Prism, so that you can at the right time turn that into a spectral shield and start coming in with it. Last thing is once you blink as Levia, you've pushed the button and you're off to the races. So you've got to be really careful if you're playing as Levia when you actually decide to start banishing and when you kind of hit that go button. And that's why people will often use that kind of game of thirds that I talked about, really set up in that first third, start to pitch stack some really strong cards so that once you hit the button and you start going with Levia, once you get through into that last part of the game, the end game, you hit your pitch stack, you know you've got all gas and you know what's coming, a bunch of 6s and Dread Screamers and things like that. So that's kind of my last tip for Monarch Draft. So there you have it, my crash course in Monarch Draft 101 almost, for all of you heading to your Dust to Dawn, War of the Monarch events this weekend. You're getting ready for Nationals. Skirmish season coming up, of course, as well with some Monarch Draft. I hope this has been helpful. You know, if you do like the videos we put out here at Arsenal Pass, make sure to drop a sub to us, drop a like on the video, and even drop a comment. Let me know, what was helpful in these videos, maybe what you'd like to see in future draft videos. Would you like to see me dive more into these archetypes? Would you like to see draft walkthroughs? I've done some of these for outsiders. I have even done some for Patreon as well. So let me know. I will be putting up like a rough kind of draft pick order list from my early testing up on Patreon if you're interested in that. Done Arsenal Pass, or patreon.com/Arsenal Pass if you want to find that. I just give you a bit of a rough idea if you're heading into some drafts soon and kind of how I'm seeing the format. This format is really deep. There's a lot of cool things you can do. I think you can play, the replayability of the draft format in Monarch is maybe at its best, which has really surprised me because I wasn't a fan of Monarch when it first came out. But it's been a nice sort of change to go back to 4 heroes after all these 3 hero sets. So yeah, let me know in the comments what you think of this format, how you're finding it, how your first few drafts have gone. Have you had any completely busted decks or done anything crazy in this format? Power level and the synergy is high. You can absolutely definitely do some crazy things. So yeah. Otherwise, go and check out some of our other limited content that we've got on Arsenal Pass. We've done stuff for other draft formats. We've also got limited time only, which is our a limited focus podcast, which we just covered a season on Outsiders. There won't be a season for Monarch Draft specifically, but next time we get a new set, we'll be revisiting limited time only and breaking down, fundamentals, getting great limited players on the pod to talk about all the ways that you can excel and advance your game when it comes to booster draft or sealed deck, if that's, a relevant format when we get to the next format. So until next time, I want to say a massive thank you to everyone out there, and Hayden signing off.